Decision making. If you are using this textbook in a course, stop for a minute and consider why you decided to take the course. Is it part of a program of study? Was this a course you've been planning to take for a while, or is it one you decided to take without much advanced planning? I suspect there are a range of possibilities, but whatever the reason, it is probably true that some students pick their courses without much extensive thought, and others plan extensively and think about which courses they need and which courses will help them most in the future. Each of these is a viable decision-making strategy. Picking your courses quickly might involve relatively more input from System 1. Picking your courses after much deliberation might involve relatively more input from System 2. Decision-making is about reducing uncertainty, minimizing risk, and maximizing benefit. Of course, many of the decisions we make are trivial. Deciding whether to have toast or a bagel for breakfast is still a decision, but it is one that has little or no uncertainty, very little risk associated with either outcome, and only a modest benefit. But other decisions are much more serious. When you are deciding on a university major or plan of study, there is uncertainty associated with the outcome. Choosing between engineering and epidemiology carries with it many unknowns. What will the job market be like for engineers and epidemiologists in 5 years' time? What are the risks associated with each program? How difficult are the courses? What is the completion rate for students who enter the program? How likely is it that you will be able to finish near the top of your class versus the middle? Will that matter? People do not like uncertainty. Animals do not like uncertainty. Uncertainty often introduces a state of anxiety. Most organisms behave in ways that reduce uncertainty and maintain a status quo. The idea of uncertainty reduction, risk avoidance, and the maintenance of the status quo are central to understanding how humans make decisions. The first half of the chapter covers the fundamental aspect of decision making, the understanding of probability and base rates. In the second half of the chapter, several theories of decision making are introduced, and these explain human decision making in terms of reducing uncertainty and maximizing outcome. Objectives. On completing this chapter, you should be able to achieve the following. Describe the basic steps in a decision-making process. Understand the primary theories of probability and how people think about and use probability. Understand the fundamental theories of decision-making behavior. Be able to identify decision-making errors, pitfalls, and shortcomings, and relate them to one or more theories. Making a decision. We make decisions every day. We decide what to have for breakfast. We decide which route to travel to work. We decide how to allocate time, money, and resources. We might decide to stay with a romantic partner or to leave. These decisions can be trivial or life-altering. They can be made quickly or with extensive deliberation. They can be right, wrong, or neither. Decision-making steps. Decisions that are made with some degree of explicit awareness often involve several steps. The first step can be called the identification stage, in which the person identifies the need to make a decision. This might be something as simple as being confronted with an overt decision, ordering food at a restaurant, or something more complicated, like deciding how to invest some of your money in the stock market. At some point prior, there was no need to make a decision, but at this identification phase, the need for a decision is realized. More importantly, the decision is framed. Framing a decision involves stating the decision in terms of known costs and benefits, or perceived gains and losses. The way in which a decision is framed can drastically alter the way that decision is made. For example, if you are deciding to enroll in a course, it may change the decision if you frame it as a requirement versus framing it as an option. One alternative is framed as something you have to do, the other is framed as something you want to do. Framing effects will be discussed in greater detail later in this chapter. A second stage is the generation stage. In this stage, the decision maker begins to generate alternatives. For example, if the decision involved where to take a romantic partner on a date, you might start to think of the options: movie club, dinner, golfing, the beach. The generation phase is affected by several factors. Individual factors, such as personal knowledge and experience, play a role by limiting or enhancing the numbers and kinds of alternatives that can be generated. Cognitive factors, such as working memory limitations, can have an effect by reducing the number of alternatives that can be generated. Environmental factors, such as the amount of time available, can also affect the number of alternatives that can be generated. Time pressure reduces the number of alternatives. These alternatives can be evaluated in a judgment stage. Judgments are made about probabilities, costs, benefits, and the value of alternatives. Judgments can be made about real or perceived risk. In many cases, judgments are susceptible to many of the biases that have been discussed in other sections of this book. Both availability and representativeness can affect how alternatives are assessed and evaluated. For example, alternatives that come to mind very quickly might be judged as favorable, but this can be an artifact of the availability heuristic. In some cases, alternatives that are highly salient and thus available in memory are likely to be brought to mind quickly. This can lead to a bias and occasionally errors if these alternatives are not optimal. Difficulties and challenges. In general, humans tend to make fairly good decisions, not exclusively, of course, but many decisions simply do not involve much risk or uncertainty. But there are occasional conflicts. Sometimes there are simply too many choices. Think of a restaurant menu with pages and pages of different choices. It can be difficult to choose. For example, when one of my kids was younger, she used to express frustration when we went out to eat because of all the choices on the menu. The problem is that she liked nearly everything. As a result, she couldn't decide what she will enjoy the most. Sometimes she will resolve this conflict by relying on a heuristic and resorting to a standard order. A chicken Caesar wrap, for example, pretty standard pub fare in Canada. I often do the same thing at certain restaurants with long menus. I find something that I know I will like and I just order that. Or think of how many media choices you might have at one time. People would have fewer than 10 TV channels to choose from, and we would select a show from that small set. In the early 2020s, there are so many streaming options, for example Netflix, Hulu, Disney+, Amazon Prime Video, etc., that there can literally seem like an infinity of options. With that many options, it can be difficult to choose unless you rely on a heuristic or some kind of strategy to limit the options. Other challenges arise when costs and benefits are compared across many alternatives, or when the alternatives are orthogonal or not directly comparable. Recall from Chapter 2 that similarity comparisons and evaluations can sometimes only be made among items that possess alignable attributes. The same kind of process can interfere with decision-making as well. For example, it might be fairly straightforward to consider the differences, costs, and benefits between several types of automobile on the metric of price or fuel efficiency or power. Considering these all together is more complex. How should one reasonably balance these attributes? Is a more expensive car with better fuel economy a better choice? This depends on the price of fuel, the future price of fuel, and the relative importance that one places on personal savings, money, versus the environmental savings of a vehicle that uses less fuel. This is not a clear-cut decision by any means, and the optimal decision changes as a function of which attributes are weighted in the generation and judgment phases. Rational approaches to decision-making. Decision-making involves a combination of knowledge about outcomes, costs, benefits, and probabilities. This section covers several theoretical approaches that attempt to explain and understand how people make decisions. Expected values. A rational approach to decision-making sets a normative standard from which we can investigate deviations. In other words, many of the characteristics and aspects of this model are rooted in economic theory and may not describe the cognitive processes behind decision-making, as well as some of the other theoretical approaches we will take. On the other hand, this rational approach describes how one might arrive at an optimal decision. The degree to which people deviate from this optimal decision can be understood in the context of other theoretical approaches, memory, knowledge, and cognitive limitations. A fundamental aspect to the rational approach is the assumption that people can make optimal decisions. In order to make an optimal decision, it is assumed that people weigh the alternatives, set an expected value, or determine the expected utility for all of the alternatives, and then proceed to choose the most valuable alternative in the long run. That is, the optimal decision is the one that maximizes the expected value, utility. The expected value can be thought of as a physical, monetary, or psychological value that is attached to a given outcome. An expected value is calculated by combining what is known about the costs and benefits with the probability of achieving a desired outcome. The formula below shows a straightforward way to calculate an expected value. Expected value equals bracket the value of the gain times the probability of the desired outcome, and bracket minus bracket the value of the loss times the probability of the non-desired outcome, end bracket. In this formula, the expected value is a function of the gain and the probability of achieving that gain minus the costs and the probability of incurring those costs. For example, consider a very straightforward set of monetary choices. One option, 1, allows you to win $40 with a probability of 0.2 or else nothing. The other option, 2, allows you to win $35 with a probability of 0.25 or else nothing. The first choice has a higher win but a lower probability. In order to decide which of these is the best option in the long run, the values can be inserted into the expected value formula as follows. So the expected value formula again is expected value equals the value of the gain times the probability of the desired outcome, all minus the value of the loss times the probability of the non-desired outcome. So for option 1, the expected value 1 equals 40 times 0.2 minus 0 equals $8, and the expected value for option 2 equals 35 times 0.25 minus 0 equals $8.75. So because these outcomes are in dollars, $8.75 is more than $8, so you would choose option 2. Despite having the higher payout, option 1 actually has a lower expected value over the long run. This is because of the way gain and probability combine. This also means that different factors can affect the long-run expected value. In cases where the outcome has some additional utility beyond the actual value, it can affect choice by increasing the value of a win or decreasing the cost for a loss. For example, many people engage in gambling and buying lottery tickets despite the negative expected value for these events. Most people agree that there is an additional psychological utility that comes from a casino game. Gambling in a casino might be fun, it might be an enjoyable social activity, or it might be part of a vacation. This would essentially minimize the impact of a loss. Biases and problems with the rational approach. As previously discussed, the rational approach is very effective at describing the optimal decision-making patterns, but very often fails to describe how people actually make decisions. People often make decisions that are in opposition to expected values and optimality. A fairly straightforward example, using the same general framework as the simple gambling option earlier, is known as a certainty effect. All things being equal, humans and many other non-human animals resist uncertainty. Uncertainty creates an unwelcome state for any organism. A bias for certainty would occur when people choose an option with a lower expected value that promises certainty instead. In the example below, option 1 has a higher payout and a higher expected value, but people may also choose option 2. That is because option 2 has no probability of a loss. In this case, it is a certain gain of $30. In option 1, the expected value equals bracket $40 times 0.8 and bracket minus 0 times 0.20 and bracket equals $32. Option 2, the expected value equals bracket $30 times 1 and bracket minus 0 times 0 and bracket equals $30. So for option 2, there's a certain gain of $30. You cannot lose. Whereas option 1, there's a 20% chance that you will lose. So even though you make more money in the long run, if you choose option 1, you might not gain anything. The effects of certainty are also seen in what is known as the framing effect. Originally described by Tversky and Kahneman, 1981, the framing effect is an illustration about how the context and semantics of a decision can affect which options seem preferable. The most well-known example consists of a short description of a scenario and 2 choices. Consider the following statements. Premise: imagine that the U.S. is preparing for the outbreak of an unusual disease which is expected to kill 600 people. 2 alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed. Assume that the exact scientific estimates of the consequences of the programs are as follows. Program A: if Program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. Program B: if Program B is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved and 2/3 probability that no people will be saved. So according to the certainty effect, you would choose Program 1. In this scenario, Most participants, 72%, choose Program A, although it is implicit in that statement that 200 people will be saved and therefore 400 people will not. The framing is in terms of lives saved. Both programs talk about lives being saved. When framed as a saving or as a gain, people generally display risk-averse behavior and prefer a certain outcome. However, imagine the same scenario but framed as the number of people who will die. Premise: imagine that the U.S. is preparing for the outbreak of an unusual disease, which is expected to kill 600 people. 2 alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed. Assume that the exact scientific estimates of the consequences of the programs are as follows. Program C: if Program C is adopted, 400 people will die. Program D: if Program D is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that nobody will die, and 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. So Program D seems better because there is uncertainty, and thus you're like gambling that it can go well. In this scenario, most participants, 78%, chose option D. Notice that the numbers are equivalent between programs A and C and B and D across both scenarios. This second scenario is framed as a loss, people dying. When a decision is framed as a loss, people generally display loss aversion and are more willing to choose the riskier alternative. This framing example is interesting because it pits loss aversion against risk aversion. Although people generally like to avoid risk and loss, avoiding loss is paramount. Curiously, both may stem from a desire to avoid uncertainty. People tend to avoid risk as a way to reduce uncertainty, but they also tend to avoid loss as a way to avoid uncertainty and protect the status quo. 9.2 Theory in the Real World. Many retail environments and stores take advantage of our preference for certainty, loss aversion, and risk aversion in the way they advertise. For example, every summer I go with my kids to purchase new sporting equipment for baseball and in the winter for ice sports. One year we went to a local sporting goods store which had a sign advertising that everything was on sale in the store, up to 50% off. One of my kids said, "It's a good thing we decided to come today, they're having a big sale." But the store always has that sign up. What is listed as the sale price is the actual price. This is seen in other retail environments, where the tag may have a suggested price that the object is never sold for. These pricing strategies present a framing effect, whereby the advertised price appears to be a bargain. The work of Richard Thaler has examined this idea more systematically. For example, consider the following descriptions of 2 gas stations with different pricing strategies. In one of Thaler's studies, participants were presented with the following scenario. Driving down the road, you notice your car is running low on gasoline and you see 2 service stations, both advertising gasoline. Station A's price is $1 per liter. Station B's price is 95 cents per liter. Station A's sign also announces 5 cents per liter discount for cash. Station B's sign announces 5 cents per liter surcharge for credit cards. All other factors being equal, the cleanliness of the stations, whether you like the brand of gasoline carried, number of cars waiting at each, to which station would you choose to go? You're going to go to the one that says it's a sale, not the one that's going to charge you extra. With no additional context, subjects tended to report a preference for Station A. The costs were identical regardless of whether subjects were asked to pay with cash or with credit. However, the first station's policy was framed as a discount for paying cash. This is interpreted as a more favorable pricing strategy, and so that station was preferred. Thaler's work, which eventually culminated in him winning the 2017 Nobel Prize in Economics, is outlined in his recent book, Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness, in which he and his co-author Cass Sunstein argue that governments and companies can help to improve decision-making and ultimately improve society by adopting policies that will nudge people in the optimal direction. They define a nudge as any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives. To count as a mere nudge, the intervention must be easy and cheap to avoid. Nudges are not mandates. Putting fruit at eye level counts as a nudge. Banning junk food does not. The idea behind nudge theory is that we can use our biases to our advantage to make better decisions. Loss aversion. Several of the preceding examples dealt with the phenomenon of loss aversion. Loss aversion occurs because the psychological value assigned to giving up something or losing something is greater than the corresponding psychological value associated with obtaining that same object. We tend to hold on to the things we already have. We tend to prefer current circumstances. Many people continue to use a favorite pen, to keep old books they like, or to use a favorite mug. More consequentially, many people stay in relationships that are not ideal for fear of losing what they have. As humans, our decisions are often ruled by loss aversion. The tendency to avoid situations that might lead to loss can lead to a bias known as the status quo bias, in which we prefer situations that maintain the status quo. We do this to avoid loss. This status quo bias can affect real-world decisions in many surprising ways. Loss aversion and the status quo bias come in several forms. In the earlier examples on framing, loss aversion came about when participants were likely to prefer riskier alternatives rather than face loss of life in the disease scenario. On a more personal scale, loss aversion, associated with small objects, is often referred to as the endowment effect. A study by Kahneman et al. 1991 investigated this effect with university undergraduates. People were divided into groups. One group, the sellers, were given university bookstore coffee mugs and asked whether they would be willing to sell the mugs at each of a series of prices ranging from 25 cents to $9.25. Buyers were asked whether they would be willing to buy a mug at the same set of prices. Choosers were not given a mug and were asked to choose for each of the prices between receiving a mug and receiving that amount of money. In other words, choosers did not have the mug, and their decision was how much they were willing to pay. It is important to note that everyone ended the study with the same amount, but what is interesting is that sellers priced the mug at a point that was nearly twice that of the choosers. The mere act of possessing the mug endowed it with greater value. Status quo also shows up in a sunk cost bias, an effect that is referred to as entrapment. This can be a very effectively used technique in a sales environment. Essentially, people are unwilling to abandon an undesirable status quo, primarily because they have already invested time or money. As an example, imagine that you and your friends go to see a movie. In Canada, where I live, the average movie price is somewhere between $12 and $15. Once you have paid your $12, you expect to see a good movie, but what would you do if the movie was truly awful? Would you stay and watch to the end, or would you get up and leave? When I ask this question in a class, most students indicate they would stay. The reason that is most commonly given is that they already paid for it. The reasoning is that if you have paid money, the sunk cost, for the movie, it is already bad, but leaving the movie will not make it any less bad, and there is always a chance, however remote, that it might get better. You would miss that chance if you left the movie. In short, once you have sunk some cost into something, you desire to see that sunk cost realized. This effect also arises in other scenarios. If you have ever been on hold with a utility or telecommunications provider seeking technical or billing support, you will have noticed that it is a common experience to be told something along the lines of, "Your call is important to us, please stay on the line and your call will be answered in the order that it was received." This can be very frustrating. There is uncertainty with respect to how soon your call will be taken. When I have been in this situation, I often feel that the longer I wait, the more resistant I am to hanging up. I am unwilling to give up sunk time. This behavior deviates from the optimal model because the cost has already been paid. Prospect theory. The biases discussed above suggest that people often make decisions which deviate from rationality. This does not mean these are bad decisions, and it does not mean that people are making decisions poorly. It just means that there are psychological reasons behind suboptimal decision-making. Kahneman and Tversky proposed an alternative to the standard economic rational model referred to as prospect theory. 1979. Prospect theory suggests that people make decisions according to psychological prospects. In addition, this theory takes into account the difficulty that most people have in correctly judging probability and likelihood. Prospect theory assumes objective probability can be replaced by psychological probability or beliefs. A key aspect of prospect theory is that loss aversion and risk aversion are primary motivators. Loss aversion looms especially large in this theoretical approach. Prospect theory is best summarized in the graph shown in figure 9.5. It shows prospect theory's value function. The x-axis shows losses and gains in terms of real value. The y-axis shows the psychological impact of those losses and gains. There are several things to note about this value function. First, both the loss and the gain curves are concave. That is, there is not a linear relationship between actual gain and the psychological impact of that gain. As shown in the graph, there might be some psychological value placed on gaining $100, but the gain of $200, twice as much, may not be psychologically twice as desirable. According to this theory, the value that you place on gains will eventually reach an asymptote. This is often referred to as diminishing returns. Figure 9.5. This graph represents the value function for prospect theory. The y-axis shows the psychological value associated with losses and gains, and the real value of losses and gains is shown on the x-axis. In prospect theory, the loss curve is steeper than the gain curve. A second thing to note about prospect theory's value function is that the curves are asymmetrical. The loss curve is steeper than the gain curve. This reflects the loss aversions and general finding that people sometimes value the status quo more than the prospect of a gain. In terms of absolute value, a gain of $100 is not worth the same as a loss of $100. As much as we may appreciate an extra $100, we are likely to take steps to avoid a loss of $100. Losses loom larger than gains, according to prospect theory. This general approach accounts for many of the findings that show people's deviations from optimality. Kahneman and Tversky, 1979, argued that prospect theory more accurately describes the psychological process behind human decision-making. We behave suboptimally because we value the status quo, we seek to avoid and minimize loss, and we seek to reduce uncertainty. These psychological drives may come into conflict with optimality. Okay, so let's take a look at the prospect theory's value function. Okay, so both the y and the x-axis have positive and negative. So on the negative end of the x-axis is losses, and on the positive end is gains, and then split down the middle is the y-axis, which on the positive axis has value. So when you look at the quadrant that is positive, so positive value on the y-axis and positive gains, it's like a parabola, like an upside down U. So you can see like the more money you gain, the value tapers off into an asymptote. The value that you place on gains will eventually reach an asymptote. And then on the negative quadrant, where it's negative value and losses, it's like a parabola that's a U shape. And the two curves are asymmetrical. So this curve is steeper because losses are heavier than gains. Loss aversion. A loss has a greater absolute psychological value than a gain. Knowledge effects in decision making. The rational approach does not rely on personal conceptual knowledge or semantic memory, but rather assumes that decisions are made in accordance with calculated expected values that arise from an understanding of probability and the costs and benefits of each outcome. Prospect theory takes into account personal and cognitive biases by assigning a role for the aversion of risk and the aversion of loss, but there are other, sometimes more idiosyncratic, factors that influence and affect people's ability to make decisions. Reason-based decision-making. In many cases, one of the influencing factors in decision-making is the ability to provide a reason for the decision. Given several options, it is likely that the most attractive decision is the one that has the best justification, even if it does not have a better possible outcome. For example, selecting a menu item at a restaurant because it conforms with a set of beliefs about what you like, seafood, allows you to give a reason. I ordered the shrimp risotto because I like shrimp. This is a great reason to order the dish, but does not necessarily reflect a rational analysis. To some degree, a prospect analysis accounts for this if the person wishes to avoid the risks associated with other dishes, but if the diner in question has never eaten risotto before, this decision suggests that risk, risotto, is mitigated by having a good reason to order the dish. I like shrimp. Shafir et al., 1993, examined this effect more systematically. Participants in their study were given one of three scenarios and asked to indicate a decision or choice. Scenario: imagine you just finished a particularly difficult final exam and you are walking home. You will not find out whether you pass the exam until tomorrow afternoon. A travel agent has assigned for an inexpensive trip to Acapulco. The offer expires that afternoon, but you can pay $5 to hold a reservation until tomorrow. Do you sign up to take the trip or pay the $5 fee? Bear in mind that the study was conducted in an era when most people made their travel plans via a travel agent and not via the web. In this scenario, the majority of the participants indicated that they would pay the extra $5 because they wanted a reason to go on the trip, pass or fail. But two other conditions shed additional light on these studies. Another condition asked subjects to make the same decision, but under the assumption they had passed the exam or another group had failed the exam. In these conditions, subjects generally indicated they would buy the ticket and forego paying the extra $5. Each group now had a good reason, passing or failing. In other words, participants in the uncertain condition were paying for information that would not affect their choice, because either reason, pass or fail, would be a good one. Participants in the uncertain condition did not have a reason yet, and so they elected to pay the $5 to defer the decision until a reason was present. Regret. People often make a decision to avoid experiencing regret for a decision that did not result in a desirable outcome. This is a form of loss aversion. When I teach this topic, I often propose the following example to students. Imagine that everyone in class receives a ticket for a drawing worth $100. This is a thought experiment, not an actual drawing. There is no cost. The tickets are free. Because it is a drawing, every ticket has the same probability of winning. No ticket can be considered a winning ticket until the drawing has been made. So when you receive the ticket, your ticket has the same probability of winning as every other ticket in the class. I then ask students if they would consider trading the ticket with the student beside them. Most students indicate that in this scenario, they would be unwilling to trade. The reason is because there is no advantage in trading with someone else, because the tickets have an equal probability of being winners. However, most students also indicate that if they had traded, and the person next to them won, they would regret having traded. In other words, people trade in order to avoid a feeling of regret. It would be difficult to avoid feeling regret and to avoid feeling like you had traded away a winning ticket, even though none of the tickets is a winner until the drawing is made. Satisficing. We tend to assume that it is optimal to be optimal. In other words, there is a psychological and behavioral premium on optimality decision-making. This has an intuitive appeal, because if we define optimal as ensuring the best outcome, it is hard to argue that optimality is the preferred state. But is there any downside to preferring optimality? Consider this scenario. You are in an airport and you have not eaten yet. You have a 3-hour flight ahead of you and you need to find something to eat in the next 30 minutes. There are probably hundreds of choices, and you want to get the best meal you can in terms of quality and value. It has to be fast, not too spicy or garlic laden. You will be on a plane for 3 or more hours, but also good tasting and healthy. You could stop at each restaurant and vendor and find out what they have to offer and compare this with reviews on social media and review sites. Using this combination of things, you might be able to arrive at the optimal pre-flight meal, but this exhaustive search and evaluation procedure might take a long time, possibly too long given the circumstances. Instead, you might look at 2 or 3 options that are close to you and choose a meal that comes close to satisfying your criteria. The best solution seems to be to set a flexible and modest threshold and choose the first option that seems to meet the basic criteria. The cost of evaluating all of the options to choose the optimal meal is significant, and the benefits are not that great. In addition, there is not much cost to a less than perfect meal in this scenario. Herbert Simon, 1972, referred to this as satisficing, which he defined as setting a criterion or aspirational level, and then searching for the first alternative that is satisfactory according to that criterion. Satisficing is sometimes called a good enough approach because, in many cases, it is a strategy that is geared towards finding an alternative that is good enough but may not be the best. It is a strategy that is explicitly suboptimal. In the airport food example, you might decide to get something for less than $15 that is not spicy. This can be met with the first sandwich, hamburger, or sushi platter that you find. Summary. Decisions underlie many of the important outcomes of cognition. In previous chapters, constructs like similarity, concepts, and induction reflected internal states and behavior. With decision-making, these internal states interact with external outcomes. Unlike many of the kinds of thinking that were discussed in earlier chapters, there are real consequences to making good and bad decisions. In Chapter 5, we discussed the interaction between language and thought. One of the points that I tried to make was that the way in which you describe something linguistically can have an effect on how you think about it. In the current chapter, this was made very clear with respect to framing effects. Decisions that are framed as a loss produce different expectations and outcomes compared to decisions that are framed as a gain. In the most striking example, the terms and outcomes were identical. The only thing that differed was the linguistic and semantic content. Although most decisions that people make are straightforward and likely to be correct or close enough, there are many times when bad decisions are made. The research and the ideas discussed in this chapter should make clear that decision-making is at once a fast and seemingly effortless process, and also a process fraught with potential errors and biases. However, cognitive biases and heuristics seem to be at play in so many different scenarios that they may not always be a source of error, but rather of fast and efficient decision-making.